After months of tackling grueling terrain and dwindling supplies, the Hume and Hovell expedition party were finally nearing the end of their epic journey. G'day, I'm Karen. Thank you for watching Life in the Bush. This is the final in my series retracing the steps of the Hume and Hovell expedition of 1824 and 25. In my last video we reached the monument at Moyu where the expeditioners had passed nearby on December 30th, 1824. In this video we're going to retrace the final leg of their journey, and at long last they make it back to Humes Outstation where they'd set out into the unknown 3 months earlier. Now, if you're interested to know what happened in the lives of the 8 explorers following this expedition, keep watching to the end. Now, at this stage in the journey, the men had about 400 kilometres still ahead of them and they were not in the best condition, yet they still had to muster the will to push through those final exhausting days. And they still had a few unexpected encounters ahead of them. If you're familiar with the history or you've been following along with the series, you'll know the goal of the expedition was to find new land for grazing and an overland path through to Bass Strait, or the south coast of what the Europeans were then calling the colony of New South Wales. With the knowledge that we have today, we now know that they passed through about 7 or 8 Aboriginal nations. And to put the timing into context, this was 200 years ago. Victoria didn't exist. Melbourne as a city didn't exist. This all came after this expedition. You might recall that on the outward journey the men chose to leave their carts and some of their supplies behind to enable them to push through the challenging terrain. And it would have been on their mind that they needed to get back to those carts now because their food rations were getting worryingly low. So they were probably feeling hopeful and perhaps a bit worried because they didn't know what condition their carts and supplies might be in when they finally reached them. We know that the return journey was proving to be a lot faster than the outward journey because they were somewhat familiar with the terrain already, but it was still very challenging given their state. They'd lost the assistance of one of their bullocks and most of their hunting dogs. Their clothes were torn. Most of the men had no shoes remaining. They were wearing moccasins that they'd made out of the skin of one of the bullocks that they'd had to eat earlier on their way home. So it wasn't an easy task. So we continue to use this book as our reference because Hovell's journal entries ceased on the 20th of December. Now, after leaving the Moyu area on December 31st, they reached the Ovens River again. They crossed the river and camped there the night. The following day, the threat of a thunderstorm motivated the men to quicken their pace, and they travelled 20 miles that day. They were heading in the direction of the Murray River, which they were very keen to reach, which they had named the Hume River at that point in time. But before they reached there, they came across a group of about 30 Aboriginal women and children. The children were engaged in play, throwing small spears formed of reeds at a circular piece of bark about 1 foot in diameter while it was rolling along the ground. And the women were employed in spinning the native flax. An old woman gave immediate notice of their approach, crying out, white man," or "Minja, Minja," which in the language of the natives of the Murrumbidgee would imply make haste, make haste. And within a few minutes all the women and children had disappeared into the bush. On the 3rd of January they reached the Murray River around midday and they rested their cattle there until the following afternoon. They fed on ducks and swans and fish. And when they did cross the river this time, unlike the outward journey when it was quite the struggle and the water levels were really high, the water levels were now very low because it was summer and so very little rain had fallen and it was much easier this time. Now, because of the hot weather, they wanted to stay close to the banks of the Murray for a while, so they travelled along the Murray until they eventually had to veer off and head home. They passed Battery Mount again, which you might remember, it's now called Tabletop Mountain, and I visited there on my journey. And the Wiradjuri name for this small mountain is difficult for me to pronounce. I'll try. Malayanyandara or Malayanyangandara, or I probably have that wrong. Broadly translated, that means home of or breeding place of the eagle, and it's known for peregrine falcons, which I did see one when I was there, although it was far in the distance and difficult to get good footage for you. After passing by the mountain, they again surprised a large group of Aboriginal people. Now they're on Wiradjuri land now, so they would have been Wiradjuri people. And again, unfortunately, they dispersed quickly when they saw the white men and their hooved animals. But it wasn't long before they came across some more Wiradjuri men who at first fled, but then came back and they were able to communicate. One of the Wiradjuri men knew a little English and they were interested in interacting with the expeditioners. The following morning, in fact, 2 of the horses strayed and 2 of the Wiradjuri men helped round them up and bring them back to the expeditioners. The Wiradjuri men invited the expeditioners to come to their camp to meet the women and the children. Hume and 3 of the men went with them, and they were then invited to stay for a corroboree, which would have been amazing. But they were so keen to just get back to their carts and get home that they declined the kind offer and went on their way. So the following day was January 8th, and I'll just read a sentence from William Bland's book here. Today was served out the last of their provisions, 6 pounds of flour to each man and some tea, while they had a journey before them of at least 150 miles to the nearest stock station, over a mountainous and difficult country, and with cattle so fatigued and crippled that they were able to make only short stages. Over the coming days, the men were getting more and more distressed. They still had to cross ranges and difficult terrain, and were finding that travelling mostly on foot without proper shoes was increasingly gruelling work. On January 10th, they reached what is now known as the Tumut River. Bland recorded that the Wiradjuri people referred to the area as Dumont. They'd been at this location on November 3rd, on their outward journey. They were seeing a lot of kangaroos, and they still had one hunting dog with them, but it was in such poor condition it couldn't hunt anymore. They managed to shoot 1 kangaroo, and they actually then made moccasins for the cattle out of kangaroo skin because the cattle were becoming so crippled. January 15, 1825 reads, "Today they rejoin their old track of the 28th of October at the upper part of Limestone Valley after a mountain journey which for fatigue and intricacy and even danger to the cattle it would be impossible adequately to describe. Sometimes over steep crags, loose stones slipping from under their feet, gullies and deep ravines traversed by small streams, and part of the distance along the bed of a rivulet, which I assume is a little stream, by which they were eventually again conducted into their former track. Out of this fine little stream they had the good fortune in the evening to procure a few fish. The whole of their flour was expended today." So they were really slowing down now. They were only a few days from civilization, but really, really short on supplies and in really poor condition. Thankfully, the following day they reached their carts. Hume and Hovell and 2 of the men hurried along to where they'd stashed their carts near the Goodra-Digby River, and the other men slowly came along behind with the bullocks. And to their relief, they found their supplies intact. So the men that had gone ahead, they got the carts back over the stream as the other men caught up with the bullocks. From this point, though, the bullocks and 2 of the men could not keep up with the rest of the group. So they continued on slowly while the rest of the men went ahead. 2 days later, they reached Humes Outstation on the 18th of January 1825. They then gathered some supplies and took them back to the other men. The good news is that all the men survived this epic expedition, and by the 24th of January they had all reached their respective homes. I can only imagine how relieved their friends were to see them again. Hovell had a wife and children to return to, so it must have been such a relief for them to see him again. What a journey. I can only Imagine how physically and mentally impacted they were from that expedition. They reached their goal. They came home exhausted, but they made it. And they're now in the history books, an important story in Australia's modern history. So, what happened to each of the men after their journey? Well, some of the men there's very little written about, while others I was able to find a little bit more. Henry Angel was awarded after the expedition with a pair of bullocks and a ticket of leave for the Illawarra district, and later a conditional pardon. He married in 1834 and had 8 sons and 8 daughters. He acquired plenty of land and spent his final years living and working in Springvale near Wagga Wagga. He stayed in touch with Hamilton Hume and even accompanied him on an expedition to the Darling River with Charles Sturt. In 1881, he died at the age of 91. Henry and his wife Mary were buried at the Wagga Wagga Cemetery and have many descendants. James Fitzpatrick went on to acquire large tracts of land around Appin and Menangle. His main property, Glenlee, was a productive dairy farm run by his descendants up until 1978. James married twice. His first wife died at the age of 60 and they had no children together. Then at the age of 71, he married 19-year-old Elizabeth. They had 3 children together and he died at home aged 85. Claude Barrois was only 42 when he died and not much is known about his life after the expedition. He spent some time in Goulburn, was awarded a ticket of leave in 1826, but that was cancelled in 1832 because he was absent from the district. Now, his employer in Goulburn did recommend him for a conditional pardon. Unfortunately, he died before receiving it. Samuel Bullard is another one who's difficult to get information on, but according to Sounding the Ground by Ron and Catherine Frew of Tumbarumba, he was issued a ticket of leave in 1825, and by the end of 1826 he'd served his sentence and earned his freedom. He died in 1868 at the age of 74. Thomas Boyd became a prosperous grazier and successful horse breeder. He married Eleanor, known as Ellen. They settled in Tumut and had 13 children. Some of Thomas and Ellen's descendants still live in and around Tumut, including Kerry Back and his family, who I was fortunate enough to meet when I visited Tumut. Kerry showed me where Thomas Boyd had owned land, not far from where Kerry raised his own family. Thomas Boyd's grave is in the Pioneer Cemetery at Tumut. And Kerry, who's a boilermaker by trade, actually built the frame to these gates at the cemetery before he discovered he was a descendant of Thomas Boyd. Benjamin Smith, again, not much is known. He had 2 children with his wife Sarah Dean, was granted a ticket of leave, but like Claude Barrois, he was young and died before he received his conditional pardon. Hamilton Hume. Hume was granted land after the expedition. He went on to become a prominent pastoralist and breeder of fine wool sheep. He became a magistrate, founded the Mechanics' Institute, and was a trustee of the Anglican Church. Hume also completed 2 more expeditions after the journey to Port Phillip, one to survey a road through the Blue Mountains and the other to map the Darling River with Charles Sturt. Hume purchased Cooma Cottage in Yass in 1839, where he lived out the remainder of his life with his wife Elizabeth. They didn't have any children together. Hamilton Hume died in 1873 at the age of 75, and he's buried in the Yass Cemetery. And last but not least, my 4 times great-grandfather, Captain William Hilton Hovell. All in all, he had a pretty good life, although he outlived his first 2 children. He went on to explore more around Victoria and Western Port. He travelled to England, to Europe, Sri Lanka and India. He lost his son Arndell tragically when he was killed by a falling tree. His first wife Esther died in 1846, and 2 years later his daughter Elizabeth died. And Hovell married his second wife, Sophia Wilkinson. He became a magistrate, was on the Commission of the Peace for Victoria and Queensland, and was appointed Commissioner of Crown Lands to act within the boundaries of the colony. He settled in Goulburn in the late 1830s and died apparently from bronchitis while in Sydney in 1875. When his second wife, Sophia Wilkinson, died the following year, she bequeathed thousands of dollars to the University of Sydney to found the William Hilton Hovell Lectureship in Geology and Physical Geography. Hovell was 89 when he died. We visited his gravesite in Goulburn at the beginning of the series. He was survived by a natural son, my 3 times great-grandfather, Albert Ross Hovell. The identity of Albert's mother is a mystery. As you know, on my journey to retrace the expedition, I came into contact with a lot of historians and I asked them all about the identity of Albert Ross's mother, but nobody knows for sure. So that's a mystery for another day. Well, that's it from me retracing the Hume and Hovell expedition. I hope you've enjoyed travelling with me on this journey. I hope you've enjoyed picking up a little bit about Australian modern history and our beautiful countryside. Let me know in the comments which town or which little bit of history you enjoyed the most throughout the series. Also, I want to shout out a big thank you to all the people I met on this journey. It's been amazing to connect with so many people interested in this history, sharing their stories and their time with me. I couldn't have done it without all of you. I'm so appreciative and I loved spending the time that I spent with you. It's been a really special part of the journey. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.